Hey students, this is Mr. Moore back with an AP European History review session. This review session is meant for those students who want to score good on the AP test, those students who have already taken the course, those students who have already taken a chance to look over their notes. The more you already know about the topic, the more sense I'm going to make. This is supposed to enhance the official study guide that's handed out from the College Board. I'm going to focus on just one topic today, and that's 2.6, 16th century society and politics. And as we're reviewing this section, I want you to keep in mind the things that we've discussed in class, the things that you've read about from the textbook, the videos that we've watched in class, the crash course videos you've watched. All of the reading and all of the learning that you've done should be coming together to help you understand all of the content you need to cover. As a reminder to all of you, there are 4 distinct time periods that this class is broken up into. And during time period 1 that covers from 1450 to 1648, there's 2 units. There's one unit on the Renaissance and exploration, and there's another unit on the Age of Reformation. Please remember that these things overlap each other in many respects. There are people who are out exploring while Martin Luther is trying to reform the church. Leonardo da Vinci is painting his Mona Lisa when Martin Luther's tacking up his 95 Theses. So you've got to remember that these things overlap each other. They're just 2, different units, actually 3 different topics, as you can clearly see, that are going to overlap each other during this time period. Why it ends in 1648, I hope without me even saying it out loud, you know. And I hope you can say more than just the Peace of Westphalia, but you can say the Peace of Westphalia ends the religious wars, this Age of Reformation, as it's sometimes called. Today on topic 2.6, we're obviously going to be talking about society and politics. One more reminder to those of you who are AP European History students, there are in fact 7 overarching themes that come up again and again in every single unit that we cover. As you can clearly see, we're going to be talking about social organization, but we're also going to be talking about politics, states, and other institutions of power. And so that's what you can see right here in the title. It's addressing those thematic units. Those thematic units are covered in every single unit, from 1450 all the way to the present time. This is Learning Objective E. What I love about these learning objectives is when you're done reviewing this, you should clearly be able to answer this. So it's telling you, student, you need to be able to explain how economic and intellectual developments from 1450 to 1648 affected social norms and hierarchies. First of all, if you don't know what social norms are, then you're kind of at a loss to answer this question. What are hierarchies? Social norms are those things in society that we deem to be acceptable. There's a certain amount of distance that we allow in society. Americans have their bubble, and in different cultures that bubble might get smaller. First time I traveled over to places like Egypt, their social bubble is a lot smaller. If you're ever around people who are from the country of India, their social bubble is a lot smaller. In the United States, we have a pretty big social bubble. We keep a distance from people. But as you meet people from different culture, they have different norms. What's acceptable? When I was walking around the streets of Egypt, you would never see a man and a woman holding hands in public, even though it was obvious that they were married. There was no public affection. The social norm in France is almost the exact opposite. I mean, you'd walk across some of the bridges in Paris, and you'd see couples going for it right there on the bench, making out. That PDA, or that public displays of affection, was huge in France. That's the norm. It's like if you come here to this part of the world. I've been to both Spain and Morocco. When you come to the country of Morocco, it's Islamic, and so the social norm is women cover up in public. You'll never see a woman really going out without covering her hair. Or some of the women will cover up their faces, right? That Islamic style. You go just across the ocean over by Malaga. I took my boys on a trip over to Spain, and we hit some of the beaches just outside of Malaga. We were staying in a little hotel right around this area in southern Spain, and so we went down to the beach. The guy at the hotel said it was a great family beach, and we showed up, and half the women were walking around the beach topless. But it wasn't weird. That's just the way it was in Spain. Whereas if you go to Morocco, you'd see the exact opposite thing. That's what social norms are. What's acceptable in a society and what's not. And every society over time develops what they think is right and wrong in their society. Hierarchies is who has power. Hierarchy is the social structure in a country, in a government, in a family. Hierarchies are who's the top dog. Some people might use the word a pecking order, right? Who's at the top, who's at the bottom. Even high schools have hierarchies, right? You know who runs the high school, who are the cool kids, who aren't. I mean, those are the kind of things that we don't mean to do, I hope, but they do tend to show up. And even these social norms are different in different parts of country. Like even in the United States, there are different styles, different attitudes that are acceptable. If you live in Wyoming for a year or two, and then you live, say, in San Francisco, you'd have almost culture shock, even though you're living in the same country. Because there's probably more people in the city of San Francisco than the entire state of Wyoming. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about social norms. So, this first bullet point says, established hierarchies of class, religion, and gender continue to define social status and perceptions in rural and urban settings. Rural is the countryside, right? That's Wyoming. Urban, that's city, that's San Francisco. And there are different, different ideas of status and perceptions of how things work. Obviously, we're talking about European history, and so we don't want to use too many examples here in our own country, but it does allow us to at least grasp on to the concept that we're looking at. Rural and urban households worked as units, with men and women engaged in separate but complementary tasks. When we think about women having a lesser role in society, women didn't have as much power in society in the past, but they weren't necessarily always seen as second class. There are definitely times where women hold their own. And the more rural a place is, it seems like those women have more of a role. They're working as hard as the men or harder. They're not just doing the work outside on the farm or in the fields, but they're also doing a lot of the household chores as well as caring for the children. So you start to see different roles for men and women, separate but complementary. I like that because I kind of feel like that whole women seen as the second sex or that lower class in society, that is happening back in this time, but I see it growing and maybe standardizing more in later centuries, interestingly enough. The Renaissance and Reformation raised debates about female education and women's role in the family, church, and society. That is a constant thing that's happening in European history. One of the things that people struggle with when it comes to making connections with historical reasoning processes is this continuity and change over time. When we use the word continuity, we mean those things that are always the same. It would be, I would feel comfortable saying that women have always had a lesser place in society. That would be something that I could probably slap on in any age of the world, but in different ways. And that's, of course, where you get the change factor. So there is that continuity, but then it also starts to change for the better and for the worse, depending on place and time. Social dislocation, coupled with the shifting authority of religious institutions during the Reformation, left city governments with the task of regulating public morals. What's okay to do? What's not okay? What should the police get involved in? What should the magistrates or authorities condone or make acceptable? And when it comes to the ideas of morals, that's where we get into this really gray area, especially in the modern world, where people feel like the government should have no say in what I think is right or wrong. That's what my moral values are. Should the government tell me that that's right or wrong morally? And that's an interesting question that's debated throughout history. Most people would say murder is wrong. Oh, duh. Most people would say child abuse is wrong. Duh. But then there's a lot of those gray areas, as was just brought up. How much should you cover up in public? If you go to European countries, the answer is you don't have to cover up very much. Yeah, right? The modesty is not a big issue in a lot of European countries. If you go to a lot of Muslim countries, women are expected to cover up. And in some countries, they actually have moral police, morality police that will go around and ticket you or fine you. I was checking out a documentary the other day about women in the country of Iran who wanted to go to soccer games. And they couldn't get in because only men were allowed. And it was almost seen as immoral for them to go. And so they were dressing up like men to try to get into this soccer game. And so it depends on which country you're in as to what is the morals. And so with the shifting religious authority, like the Catholic Church having less authority, the church used to guide what was right and wrong. But with different forms of Christianity sprouting up around Europe, well, then it's left to like the city governments to figure out what's right and wrong. And sometimes they get it really wrong, right? They'll punish people for doing things that maybe they shouldn't. Leisure activities continued to be organized around the religious calendar and the agricultural cycle and remained communal in nature. I just go back to that, like, why do we have summer off in the modern school system? You know, why do we get winter break? It always is around Christmas, right? We still follow religious calendars. We don't ever get a break in school from Ramadan. We don't really get off a school break for Yom Kippur or for Diwali. But when it comes to Christmas, well, we do. And when it comes to summer, that's so people could go and work on the farm. And so you can still see that our calendars are very much based around religious events and the agricultural cycle, having those celebrations in the fall and that whole idea of spring, you know, and the planting of the harvest. Agricultural societies, right? Those societies that are based in farming. Local and church authorities continued to enforce communal norms through rituals of public humiliation. I don't know if you've ever heard of the stocks. People being, their head and their hands put into the stocks. If they did something, people could walk by and spit on them and make fun of them. Those are some of the things that were happening to try to regulate the morale or the morals of societies. Reflecting folk ideals and social and economic upheaval, accusations of witchcraft peaked between 1580 and 1650. Now, I talked about witchcraft, but I talked about it in conglomeration with what we call the scientific revolution. So if you want to go back to your scientific revolution notes, that's where we talked about, here's a great example of, say, like Islamic women, right? Covering up their faces and keeping themselves modest when we are dealing with like social norms. Not to get too sidetracked right here, but in this unit, when we talked about the scientific revolution, that's when I decided to talk about witchcraft and misogyny, that putting women as the second sex in a lower rung. Unfortunately, most of the people who were accused of being witches were women, so that kind of shows the sign of the times. I even told a story in some of my classes about a castle I visited in Germany called Kolkum Castle in the Mosel Valley. It's very much in western Germany. And this castle had on it a witch's tower. And when we were doing the tour, the lady stopped and explained to us in English and said when they were going to test to see if somebody was a witch, they would push them out of the witch's tower, and if they fell and hit the ground, then they were innocent, but dead or injured. If they flew off into the night sky, then they knew that they were a witch. And anyways, that doesn't sound like the brightest way to determine if somebody is a witch. But witch hunts are some of the scary, during the 1600s really is when we hit this peak of witch hunts. I taught that principle when I was teaching the scientific revolution, just because I think it kind of showed the irony, both sides, as we're becoming more scientific, but also hanging on to those superstitions and those folk ideals, right? Those folk ideas. Here's some illustrative examples of the period continued social hierarchies. Prestige of land ownership. That means if you own land, you're better than other people, right? Those that had land in European society held the power, going back to the fiefs and manors and landlords of the Middle Ages. I'd like to point out then that if you're thinking to yourself, man, we still call people who have property and rent it to other people as landlords. That's a complete medieval word that we're still using, but it kind of shows that prestige of land ownership even today. If you owned land, you're more important. Even when the United States was first founded, the only people who could vote in the early United States, women couldn't, misogyny. Blacks couldn't, right? That's social hierarchy. But even white men could not vote unless they owned land. So we see that there's different distinctions even in the United States when it was first being formed. The land was all claimed in Europe, thus the only open land was in the New World. A major motivation for people to leave and seek out a better life in the Americas. One of the reasons people flocked to the colonies during the 1600s, like the Pilgrims, right? The Mayflower showing up, and obviously in the early 1600s, we're going to get Jamestown in what's present-day Virginia, and we're going to get the Plymouth Rock settlement with the first Thanksgiving. People are leaving Europe because they're sick of the religious conflict going on, so they want some religious freedom. And there's also no land. It's all claimed by the nobility. And so they're seeking out better life in the Americas. Let's look at this next one right here. It says, aristocratic privileges regarding taxes, fees for service, and legal protection. A powerful example of the privileges of the nobility is the Second Estate in France prior to the French Revolution. They were exempt from taxes, meaning they didn't have to pay them. We're not in a position to talk about the French Revolution today. But I'd also like to remind you that this video is created for students who are reviewing for the AP test. And so you're putting those connections together. During the French Revolution, one of the things that motivated the French Revolution was the fact that the Second Estate, the nobles, didn't have to pay taxes. The very people who are in a position to pay taxes. The First Estate was the church. The Second Estate was the nobles, and the Third Estate were the bourgeoisie, right? The merchants, the lower class, even down to the very poorest. But those, the very poorest, the Third Estate, were the ones who had to pay all the taxes. And so that's one prime example, perhaps falling a little out of this time frame. But again, we're trying to make those connections across periods at this point in class. Political exclusion of women. European dynasties were patriarchal. Patriarchal means they were passed down from father to son. That's why Henry VIII wanted to have a son, right? Pastor, the oldest male heir. All kings wanted a son to keep the power in the family. That's also one of the reasons a lot of families intermarried. The Habsburgs are famous for intermarrying. It's that old redneck joke. If your family tree doesn't fork, you might be a redneck. Or European royalty, right? They would marry cousins so that they could keep family holdings within the family, and so they wouldn't have to spread out the wealth. There are a few examples of female rulers in Europe, especially people like Mary, right, the daughter of Henry VIII, and then the second daughter, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. Those are a couple of the British queens, right? And there are few and far between. Later on, we'll talk about Catherine the Great in Russia. She's one of the more dominant leaders in Russia, and we definitely talked about Catherine the Great. And then, of course, in a previous session, we talked about, say, Catherine de' Medici, but they're few and far between is the thing. Most of the people who hold the power in European society are the men. Debates about female roles. Women's intellect and education. Women did not have the same access to education that men did. Thus, some men felt that they were academically inferior to men. So some men would use this argument that women weren't as smart as men. And then some of the women would point out, yeah, but we haven't had the same opportunities. If you gave us the same opportunities as men, then we could hold our own. Okay? So when women start getting access to education, they proved to be just as capable of men. But that was one of the debates that was used at the time. Women as preachers. I'm going to quote a little bit of the Bible right here, and you can go look it up if you want later on. A lot of Christians have used this to say that women shouldn't be leaders in a Christian church. I don't think this is what Paul really means, but anyways, women as preachers, Catholic, Orthodox, and most Protestant Christian churches did not allow women to participate fully, right? One exception was the Quakers. They did allow women to hold a pretty comparable spot in their Christian churches. Many of these Christian churches used a passage of Scripture from the book of Corinthians in the New Testament. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Acts, and the Romans, and then you have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. After that, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, etc. But the Corinthians, chapter 14, verse 34, as their reasoning to not allow women to have leadership roles. So if you go look that up, you can make your own interpretations from there. But it's one of the things where Paul seems to kind of woman bash sometimes. So I'm not sure what issues he had earlier in his life, but he seemed to not want women to have the same role as men in Christian churches. I am not really great at French. L'équerre de femme, the woman question, refers to a literary debate about the fundamental role of women in society during the Renaissance and plants the seed for later women's right movements like feminism. So this is a French literary debate about what role women should play in society, and I think this kind of lays the groundwork for like the modern feminist movement. And that woman question, where should women be in society? What role should they be? And this is maybe a look at early feminism. Regulating public morals. New secular laws regulating private life during medieval times. It was the role of the church to control the morals of the people. As secularism, that's non-church stuff, gained momentum during the Renaissance, and as religious pluralism, more than one form of Christianity, formed during the Reformation, means the church could no longer have the power to say what was right and what was wrong. Okay? Thus, non-church institutions started having a bigger role in making laws that regulated public morals. I'd like to point out here, and maybe you can giggle and laugh at this, but the commentary after these blue phrases, that's kind of my commentary. So if you ever see a typo or a mistake, that's me just trying to, pound out some commentary to give it some life. Everything else, like these bullet points up here, are literally copied and pasted directly from the AP European History study guides, these key concept study guides. They gave me a list of illustrative examples of the period, and then I just added some commentary in there. So again, if you ever see any kind of typos, you could let me know in an email, and we could clean that up. But that's what we're talking about right here. The churches, there's this idea about who should have the ability to say what is right and wrong in society. Okay, churches no longer have that power, and so non-church institutions start to play a bigger role. So that's what's happening because of secularism from the Renaissance and this pluralism from the Reformation. It starts to change what's right and wrong. So in society today, if you get busted for doing something wrong, you can't go to prison or jail because somebody said you broke a commandment in the Bible. The reason you would get in trouble is because the state, right, the federal government, has made up laws and regulations. And I do know there's a tie going back to religion, but definitely we're not throwing people in jail for breaking a commandment of God. We're throwing people in jail for breaking a law of the state of California, or a town ordinance in Apple Valley, or a federal law that has to be regulated. This is a college level class, so we have to deal with everything and anything. Stricter codes on prostitution and begging. During medieval times, the church was the source of social welfare. So if people were poor, it's the church that took care of them. But that starts to transition because the church starts to lose some of its power during this Reformation time. The ideal of the noblesse oblige, right? The noblesse oblige, a French phrase that means those who have the responsibility to help. Okay, so they start replacing the whole church being in charge of social welfare, but slowly government and non-religious institutions start to become the caretakers of the beggars in society. Poor young women who had little education and no way to earn a living in urban areas in Europe often turned to the oldest profession in the world. That's prostitution. Unfortunately, women had very little a chance to get a decent job, and if their fathers wouldn't take care of them or couldn't take care of them, or they were orphaned, they really had no other choices. And so most of these girls, of course, would never choose prostitution. It was something that was forced upon them because they're starving to death. And STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, were a major health problem in large urban cities. So stricter codes on prostitution and begging. Abolishing or restricting Carnival. If you've ever heard of again, there's a French city over in France called Orléans. And when the French set up a port city here in the New World, they called it New Orleans, right? New Orleans. So if you come down here, in fact, inside the city of New Orleans, there's actually something called the French Quarter, and they celebrate one of the biggest carnivals in the United States called Mardi Gras, right? And that's that French celebration. Also, if you're familiar in the very heavily Catholic country of Brazil, in places like Rio de Janeiro, you'd be finding places like they actually call it Carnival. Places like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Carnival is a huge celebration. And so what happened is some governments were trying to abolish or restrict Carnival. And Carnival is a celebration where elaborate costumes and masks allow people to set aside their everyday individual. Participants often indulge in excessive consumption of alcohol and do things that are not socially acceptable under normal circumstances. If you know anything about Mardi Gras, one person said if you saw somebody walking down the sidewalk naked holding a rubber chicken, nobody would turn and look because it's Mardi Gras. It's just, anyways, people do things that they normally wouldn't do all the time. They set aside their everyday individuality, right? And they don't, they drink too much, and they do things that are not normally socially acceptable. And so obviously that's why the governments were trying to restrict this carnival. They can get a little bit out of hand. like sometimes Mardi Gras does. Communal leisure activities, Saints' Day festivities, celebration of all saints, particularly those who have no special feast days of their own, in many Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant churches. So they set up Saints' Days. That's communal leisure activities where they have carnivals and stuff like that. Again, if I ever have a word that shows up more than one time, like I just thought, hey, we already explained what carnival was. Why would I do that again? Also, one of the communal leisure activities of the time are blood sports. And if you're thinking of like karate, no, I'm talking about things like jousting tournaments, right? So if you've ever been to a Renaissance fair, right? Um, at its worst, think about the old Roman gladiators fighting to the death in the Colosseum. That's a blood sport. But we're not talking about the Romans. We're talking about the end of medieval times and into the Renaissance. So in that time, blood sports could include jousting tournaments, which really are done for sport and not intended to be to the death, but people often would have accidents and die while doing it. So it's not meant to be to the death, but they do get pretty intense, and it's a way for soldiers to continue to train. Just a few more things until we get to the end of this unit. You can see we're covering 2.6 right now. We're going to talk about the rituals of public humiliation, like the chivalry, a folk custom in which a mock parade was staged through a community, accompanied by a discordant mock serenade to express disapproval of different types of violation of community norms. So you get people going around parading, mocking bad things, trying to make sure that everybody knows what the social norms are. As I said before, the stocks, restraining devices that were used as a form of corporal punishment and public humiliation. Stocks consist of placing boards around the ankles and wrists, whereas in the Priori, the boards were fixed to a pole and placed around the arms and neck, forcing the punished to stand. So there's different kinds of stocks. There's some where you get to sit down and your ankles and your wrists, are locked up so you can't move. People can walk by, throw food at you, pee on you, spit on you, whatever, because you did something wrong in that community. And remember, they're trying to curb bad behavior. So if you're caught cheating, one of the most interesting things that I did when I was in Europe is I took my kids to this museum, and it had all these old torture devices. And I know that sounds sick and weird, but we saw some of these like helmets that were placed on people who had committed adultery, and the spikes were facing in, and then you were forced to wear around this metal mask with like spikes pointing in at your head if you were caught committing adultery. Of course, that was generally just for women who were committing adultery. The men who they were committing it with generally weren't being punished the same way, and that's a huge double standard. Something that's, as we might say, as we talked about when we talked about witchcraft, misogyny, right? So this next bullet point right here says public whipping and branding. Public humiliation was taken to an extreme by using physical punishments to control undesirable behaviors in various societies throughout history. One example in the New World colonies is the story of the Scarlet Letter. Don't remember if you, but this girl's accused of committing adultery, and so she has to sew this like adulterous sign on her dress, so everywhere she goes, people know she committed adultery. Again, the dude who commits adultery with her is not in the same boat as she is. The last thing we're going to cover briefly, because we've already touched on some of it, is factors in witchcraft accusation. The prominence of women. In other words, out of all of the people who were accused of witchcraft, the vast majority of them were women, okay? And there was all kinds of trials that were done. One of the famous ones is the water trial, where you throw an accused witch, you throw her into a body of water, and the water represents purity. So if she's pure, the water accepts her, aka she starts to drown. If the water rejects her, aka she starts to float, then she's evil and therefore a witch. So they weren't exactly very scientific, which is why I talked about it during the scientific revolution, to show that conjunction there and show it juxtaposed one to another. But from 1450 to 1750, spanning the upheaval of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, the witch hunts resulted in an estimated, look at these numbers right here. I was being very cautious in my notes when I said 45,000. You can find all kinds of staggering numbers. We don't have exact numbers, but maybe as many as 100,000 executions. Some estimates go as high as 200,000 or more witches being tortured, burnt, or hanged in the Western world. Okay, most of those accused were women, and misogyny, that hatred of women, or women being mistreated, or women being looked down on, or women treated as a second-class citizen. Okay. There's just a couple other bullet points here. Regional variation. How can you tell if she's a witch? The water test. Floats the water, rejects her. I just told you that story right there. Or the witch's tower. I've covered both of those in this, so I'm not going to go into it. When it says regional variation, that means how would they find out if somebody was a witch, right? What were the trials, the witch trials? And I've explained both of those in this review session. Social upheaval. In a witch trial, the power goes to the accuser, not the accused. If you are even accused of being a witch, the evidence in the trial is your word against the accuser. Mix this in with religious superstition and mass hysteria breaks out. Remember the Crucible and the Salem witch trials. The Crucible is a famous book and a famous movie, a famous play about these girls who accuse people of being witches. And once you're accused of being a witch, there's almost no way out of it. If you're going to be pushed out of a tower or thrown into a body of water, I shouldn't giggle, but it gives all the power to the accuser. Folks, this is going to conclude this review session on topic 2.6, 16th century society and politics. This is Mr. Moore signing off.